The Famicom goes hard as Nintendo prepares to go international. It's NES Works Gaiden. Moving into 1985, the complexion of Famicom games is about to change. Most of the releases we saw in 1983 and 84 are familiar to Westerners from their releases on the NES. But going forward, that won't always be the case. Sure, there'll be some familiar games, but there's going to be quite a few that never make it to the US or Europe. Once we hit spring 1985, the Famicom diverges pretty radically from the NES, paving the way for the hundreds upon hundreds of games each region would see unique to that region. Of course, here at the beginning of the year, third parties are still coming up to speed, so 1985 begins with some awfully familiar looking games for American fans, like Balloon Fight here, previously covered in NES Works 1986. Balloon Fight fares better in its Famicom context, coming half a year before the Super Mario Bros. Revolution. A simple arcade-style game in the mold of Joust, it has the benefit of not having much in the way of direct precedent on Japanese consoles. True, Joust itself had made its way to Japan on the Atari 2800. Remember that the 2800 didn't arrive until after the Famicom had launched, a fact that effectively doomed the platform. Why buy a 6-year-old console from another country when the spicy new Japanese Famicom was an option? Or even the SG-1000 for that matter. Balloon Fight may have been more or less the same game as Williams' hit, but it fell decidedly more in line with the tastes and interests of the Japanese gaming audience. The realistically proportioned birds and faceless knights of Joust became chubby little cartoon men flapping furiously through the air in order to propel themselves while dangling from helium balloons, a comical and appealing aesthetic update. Balloon Fight also shifted the gameplay to be somewhat more forgiving than Joust's. Whereas in the older game, being struck from above by an enemy lance spelled instant doom, Balloon Fight allowed players to survive a single unlucky collision by giving them 2 balloons to keep them aloft. Only after the second popped would your fighter plunge into the water. Balloon Fight also introduced a combat-free secondary mode called Balloon Trip, which amounted to a simple test of balloon piloting skills. Tasking players to travel as far as possible while avoiding stars rather than enemies, Balloon Trip's scrolling journey felt far more contemporary than the single-screen combat of the basic mode. Hirokazu Hip Tanaka's excellent sound design factored heavily into the game's appeal, too. Although the standard combat mode was set to a minimalistic soundscape of low-frequency humming and action sound effects, Tanaka's knack for giving even simple game audio effects a melodic cadence made Balloon Fight a charmingly musical experience. Of course, his theme for Balloon Trip mode is an all-timer, one of the early greats of the NES library. As much as Tanaka contributed to the game, however, the real MVP award for Balloon Fight has to go to Satoru Iwata. As we've seen several times, Iwata played pinch hitter for Nintendo during the early Famicom years. He helped program several AtariSoft properties as part of a prospective Atari-Nintendo partnership, 3 of which would eventually see release from his employer, HAL Labs. He helped put together Golf for NES, and came up with the smooth-scrolling road graphics routines for F1 Race. Iwata knew his way around the 6502 processor, and Nintendo relied on his expertise to help bulk up their console library and give the system a distinct technical advantage over the Sega SG-1000 and Epoch Cassette Vision. Iwata goes to bat once again here, almost certainly drawing upon his experience programming the Famicom conversion of Joust, which existed somewhere in the code archives, but wouldn't ship to retail until 1987 in Japan. This gave Nintendo a leg up for its facsimile of that arcade classic. Specifically, Iwata stepped in to tweak the routines for flight to make character movement smoother, more subtle, and more responsive. Given that the entire game revolves around flight, he more or less salvaged the whole project, and he did a fine job of it. The Balloon Fight style of game, a more or less single-screen arcade-style action title in which 1 or 2 players compete for high scores, still dominates the Famicom here at the beginning of 1985. There's very much a place for a game that harkens to arcade classics, elevates the play control, makes the visuals more appealing, adds an addictive single-player mode, and throws in some sweet tunes on top of it all. This format would begin to fall into disfavor as the year winds on, and larger-scale action games like Super Mario Bros. And Challenger take over, not to mention adventures like Portopia Renzoku Satsujin Jiken. For now though, Balloon Fight sees the Famicom flying high. Another black box classic of sorts hits Famicom with Ice Climber. With its emphasis on cooperative play, shallow jump arcs, and smacking things overhead, this is very much a spiritual successor to Mario Bros., a connection that's a lot easier to appreciate here on Famicom than it was on NES, thanks to this game arriving after Mario Bros. On Famicom, as opposed to before the way it did on NES. Speaking of Mario, that guy really put a wet blanket over Popo and Nana. In the West, Ice Climber had the unfortunate fate of shipping before its spiritual inspiration, Mario Bros., but concurrently with that game's radically improved sequel, Super Mario Bros. As NES launch games that both revolve around jump-based character action, Ice Climber and Super Mario Bros. Can't help but invite comparisons, and this does not work in Ice Climber's favor. Here in the context of the game's original Famicom chronology, however, that game doesn't feel instantly obsolete. Famicom had only a handful of action games by this point, and only Devil World had emphasized anything like vertical scrolling. Even competing systems lacked much in the way of convincing platform action games. The genre was only just beginning to establish a proper foothold in arcades. By the standards of early 1985, Ice Climber has a lot to offer. It brought simultaneous two-player platforming action based around vertical progression to Famicom. Although its jump mechanics make use of the same shallow arcs as Mario Bros., which can make your upward progression from floor to floor a little touchy, it pushes the console a step forward in game design and ambition. Something you've surely noticed as I've made my way through early Famicom and SG-1000 releases is that quite a few third-party titles showed up on both platforms. Often the head-to-head comparison doesn't work out in Sega's favor, given the SG-1000's more modest hardware power, but rarely does the disparity hit quite so hard as it does here with Jaleco's Exerion. Xarian on Famicom doesn't hold up to the arcade game admittedly, but the high-concept visual gimmick of Jaleco's shooter plays out a whole lot better on a console with support for actual background scrolling than it did on SG-1000. The difference in sprite-pushing power counts for a lot too. As a shooter, Xarian relies heavily on its visual gimmickry, which means that a comparatively powerful system like Famicom was better able to reproduce that gimmickry. The background horizon effect scrolls past in a more convincing way here than on Sega's console, even if it's not exactly a lifelike effect. Enemy sprites appear larger on Famicom than on SG-1000, and they feature more colors and detail. Rather than the abstract blobs of the Sega rendition, the monsters you face here bear a close resemblance to their arcade counterparts, including the occasional bonus creature that is very definitely King Ghidorah. The Famicom cart retains the inertial weight of flight seen in the other versions, and that too benefits from the smoother motion found in the Famicom release. Rather than maneuver on a dime, your fighter craft takes a moment to reverse directions, forcing you to take greater care as you evade enemy craft and projectiles. It's a pretty strong start for Jaleco, who makes their debut as a Famicom third-party here. As we've seen with previous titles to appear on multiple platforms, Jaleco published this cartridge themselves rather than needing to license it to Sega. I will say that Nintendo's laissez-faire attitude toward third-party publishing in the early days sometimes had its drawbacks. Nintendo clearly let Jaleco publish their own boxes, and for some horrible reason, Jaleco decided to be the sole third-party publisher to print the backs of their boxes upside down. It's not a world-ending crisis, but it grates on my nerves every time I handle one of their games. Exerion actually appears to be a double debut for Famicom. Not only does this mark Jaleco's arrival on the platform, from what I can tell, it was also the first release for the system to have been developed by beloved outsourcing house TOSE. Of course, such was the nature of TOSE's contributions to the NES that they may well have put in a secret appearance on the system long before Xarian shipped. Maybe, maybe not. But there's no question that from this point on, TOSE would be a Famicom fixture. The Game Developer Research Institute has determined that a sizable percentage of 1985 releases for the console, more than a third of them, would have TOSE's fingerprints on them. And, in that sense, Xarian isn't too shabby a debut, a reasonably respectable interpretation of a decent arcade shooter. It is unfortunately overshadowed by the very next release for Famicom, a game whose sound design Xarian rather egregiously swipes from. Namco's Galaga. I mean, listen to this. And now it's time for another rendition of Galaga. Well, I say another as though there have been so many, but actually, historically and chronologically speaking, this is only the second home console conversion ever to come to the market. Thanks to my imperfectly chronological approach to this video series, we've already seen this game for SG-1000 and Atari 7800, and the NES version is coming up in the main NES Works series before long. At the time of its debut on Famicom, it only had the Sega port to compare against, and it compares well. In fact, this version is nothing short of fantastic, maintaining Namco's standard for top-caliber arcade-to-console conversions. Certainly, it works a lot better on the Famicom hardware than Xarian did, even if it sounds almost exactly the same. Galaga, of course, began its life in arcades as the sequel to Galaxian. Galaxian had been a landmark game release in its day, not only because it was one of the very first full-color arcade releases ever, but even more so because Namco's arcade board design standardized the way nearly all game devices would handle moving object sprites going forward. Bearing that in mind, Galaxian was also 5 years old by the time it arrived on Famicom. Not quite a relic, but certainly dated. As competent as the Famicom adaptation had been, this was fundamentally older material than anything else on the console. Being of a more recent vintage by a couple of years, Galaga definitely felt fresher. In fact, it's practically a perfect fit for Famicom. No, the conversion itself does not achieve the tantalizing, impossible goal of arcade perfect. Perhaps no Famicom release ever would. Galaga shipped with a vertically oriented monitor in arcades, and while its shift to a horizontal screen display involves fewer compromises than Xevious' port entailed, there's still no mistaking this for the arcade cab. It's really close though. I would argue that Galaga hails from a very narrow window of arcade technology for which the stock Famicom was eminently suited. The console could handle all the moving objects seen in the arcade version, handle its AI routines precisely, duplicate its audio design almost perfectly, and generally retain the same proportions and balance that made the coin-op release so great. Perhaps not coincidentally, Galaga debuted in 1981, the same year as Donkey Kong, the coin-op game the Famicom's hardware designers specifically sought to emulate. Namco's homegrown take on Galaga for Famicom simply outclasses Sega's. Nothing is really lost here. The difficulty scales smoothly, rather than taking a sudden prodigious leap at stage 10. The acrobatic enemy patterns pinwheel speedily through space. And of course, the bonus stages and transforming enemies make their way to the home console version intact as well. In my opinion, Galaga is one of the few truly perfect arcade games, an exquisitely balanced creation to which nothing can be added and from which nothing can be subtracted without undermining its excellence. The risky strategy of sacrificing a ship to boost your firepower while also increasing your profile as a target, the undulation of the invaders-inspired enemy fleet, the ebb and flow of combat punctuated by bonus breather stages. It all comes together and creates a truly special game. The Famicom version may not reproduce the arcade game to the pixel, but it's close enough to be a true high point for the console. It's not for nothing that Namco has often featured this version of the game in many of its reissues rather than the actual arcade ROM. It's such a lovingly crafted conversion that there's honestly no cause for complaint. And finally, another American Bruderbund game comes to the Famicom courtesy of Hudson, before being released back to the US courtesy of Bruderbund. That's right, it's Will Wright's Raid on Bungeling Bay, or as the Japanese title text would have it, just Bungeling Bay. Bungeling Bay didn't make much of an impression on NES. That's because Bruderbund released it in 1987, well after games like The Legend of Zelda and Castlevania had made their way to the console. A primitive-looking game like this, with such a limited sandbox, simply didn't have a chance of standing apart. But here, in the game's original console context, shipping not too terribly long after the original Commodore 64 release, seen in this light, Bungeling Bay holds up a lot more impressively than it did on NES. For one thing, its single map design didn't seem nearly so limited when it appeared on shelves alongside dozens of single-screen games. Raid on Bungeling Bay is the first Famicom release to feature free-scrolling gameplay. The player's attack helicopter can move in 8 different directions, and the screen will follow along. That's a truly impressive feat in this context. Nintendo built the Famicom to support scrolling on a hardware level, which gave the system a technical leg up on the competition. I mean, just look at all the choppy scrolling routines we've seen on SG-1000 by this point. But at least SG-1000 had scrolling. Despite the Famicom's deliberate inclusion of that tech, hardly any developer had used it. Loadrunner scrolled one screen horizontally per stage. Ice Climber scrolled vertically upward a few screens, and Devil World could scroll both horizontally and vertically, but only one direction at a time, and that's it. By contrast, Bungeling Bay lets you zip around at high speeds and change the direction of your motion very nearly on a dime. And no matter how you choose to dart around, the screen zips along obediently. It's an impressive bit of programming that once again demonstrates Hudson's prowess with his hardware. I've never heard of Bungeling Bay being a dearly beloved hit among Famicom fans, but it had to have been highly inspirational, or at least aspirational, for the Mini Famicom developers about to enter the market. Before long, it's going to be difficult for games to stand out on Famicom as the release schedule shifts into high gear. But with their conversion of Bungeling Bay, Hudson once again established themselves as the third party to beat on Famicom. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, more from Hudson and Galaga, and a new third party enters the fray.